All right, so I think our 5-minute grace period is over, so we'll go ahead and get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Congrats to making it to the end of the first full week of school. So give yourself a round of applause. You don't actually have to do that, I'm just kidding. But in any case, I'm going to be leading the philosophy lecture and doing some intro stuff today. If you missed me on the first week, my name is Simona Capizani, and I'll be also leading the philosophy precepts along with my colleague, Colin Hickey, who's over here in the front row. So maybe some of you have already been in precept, but hopefully we'll get all of us kind of up to speed and on the same page about philosophy and the Nexus today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Some learning goals for today that I hope we get through in the next 45-50 minutes is to kind of get a sense about what moral philosophers and political philosophers like me do, and where we might be situated in this larger conversation that's coming up in the Nexus course. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what moral theorizing is, and again, how it might fit within the framework of the sorts of arguments and things that we're going to be seeing in class here. And also to ask how we might evaluate moral arguments or moral theories. And then also how we might work through maybe certain kinds of moral disagreements that we would be having, or certain controversial moral issues, which are of course bound to come up throughout the course. Of course, here we'll be focusing on moral issues that are coming up within the context of the environment, climate change, maybe social political questions, questions about how to orient our institutions, how we ought to relate to one another. So we're bound to have disagreements about that. And so how do moral philosophers deliberate and adjudicate between these different kind of beliefs and arguments that we might be having? Then I kind of want to turn and pivot to talking about values. So in the first section, we'll probably talk a little bit about how values are there sneaking in within your reasons and then your choices and actions that you do. But this sort of second focus of values, we're going to see how they might appear in certain kinds of objective frameworks that we don't assume values might appear. So that might be in our scientific frameworks or in our economic frameworks. So we want to interrogate to what extent values are there. And I'm just going to put forward this little proposal that it's not bad that values are necessarily appearing in these what otherwise are seemingly objective frameworks, but rather that we might want to understand and make transparent the kind of work values are doing within these frameworks. Okay. And then finally, I want to lead us off into the conversation to sort of set up for the rest of the semester about how climate change and the environment is the context within which we're going to be evaluating some kind of moral problem. So I want to kind of put out there, to what extent might we understand climate change as a moral problem? What are some of the different questions that come up? Okay, so that's kind of the takeaway learning goals from today. And I do want to try, we're not actually that big of a group, so I do want to try to see if we can get some discussion going. I'm assuming no one's ever taken a philosophy class before, but just like show of hands, has anyone taken a philosophy class before? Oh, that is way more than I actually assumed, so that's awesome. So maybe we'll rely a little heavier on you, and those that aren't still also feel free to participate. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of an exchange going without assuming that you need to know very much. Okay, so I am a moral and political philosopher, as is Colin, and we have an entire department here at the university that has moral philosophers in them and political philosophers. What do we do every day? I think sometimes there's a weird image of what philosophers are, what they do. Maybe you think of like Santa Claus kind of looking people or something when you think of who a philosopher is. But specifically with moral and political philosophers, some of what's involved in our job is to try to help and provide some critical analysis and to be able to provide and generate certain kinds of arguments for moral questions and moral views. And we'll kind of get a little bit more into discussing what that means. But we might be developing or revising certain kinds of moral theories which set judgments, propositions, or principles that can help govern what we or groups of people might think about what we ought to do, right, in certain kinds of actions, or how we might deliberate to some extent about right or wrong. So I'll go into a little bit of those differences in a second. But one thing that I think philosophers can do that is helpful, especially in an interdisciplinary context like we are here, is to try to help maybe explain or clarify or refine or sharpen our understanding of certain concepts that we might take for granted the meaning of, or certain kinds of assumptions that may be boiled into some of our moral thinking, or in how we think about how we relate to one another, to societies or institutions, and to generally answer or at least raise the questions about how we ought to arrange our collective life, both together with other humans, but also maybe with non-human animals and the natural world. So I just have an example here of two moral philosophers that you maybe might have heard of. Judy Thompson, who has since passed away relatively recently, kind of became famous in the public. She's pretty notable for her arguments about ethical justifications for abortion. Anyone heard of Judy Thompson at all in your philosophy classes? Yeah, you might have read her a couple times. And then Charles Mills is a political philosopher over at CUNY. Has anyone heard of his racial contract at all? Nice, yeah, so some of you. So helps interrogate sort of these intersection points with race and political philosophy. So there are some examples of work. They may not come up in our particular class, but just if you are familiar with them, you might have come across their work. Okay, so I keep talking about moral theories and moral arguments as sort of this currency that us as moral philosophers might be engaging in. And I keep saying that, but I don't want to presume we know what a moral theory is, right? So when you hear me say that, or maybe those of you that have been in a philosophy class before, what do you think I mean by a moral theory? What do you think it does, or what do you think its purposes or its aims are, or even just a moral argument? Anyone want to take a stab at what kinds of questions moral theories may want to try to answer? Yeah, sure, thanks. And say your name so we can, yeah. Okay, good. So there's raising the question of what we might mean when we're saying that something is right or has that particular kind of property, but also you're saying that there's a provided explanation for why that might be the case. Nice. Does someone want to give an example of what that might look like applied to a specific issue or topic? Take a stab at it. I mean, do you encounter these out in the wild with one another? Yeah. That's a wonderful question, right? Can we even be able to abide by certain kinds of ethical expectations when we are situated within a context of capitalism? I think about that every day. Any others that you might maybe are pressing, or when you came into this class you were thinking of, and then that's why you wanted to sign up for this class? Okay. Maybe some questions will come as the class continues. So yeah, one particular aim that Rosemary was bringing up is trying to answer general questions about what makes actions right or wrong, or what might make a certain kind of entity good or bad, or a certain kind of way of being good or bad. So there might be this theoretical aim, which explores these underlying aspects or natures of right and wrong in order to explain what about that action would give it that kind of rightness or wrongness. And it helps us sort of uncover these underlying features of maybe actions or persons or other things that we want to have this moral evaluation of. I also think, and some of you kind of maybe have gestured to this, I think maybe even the question of ethical consumption, right, under capitalism, is tapping into actions and choices that we make. So how we might think that certain kinds of moral theorizing might also have this kind of practical aim, right, which is to help us, or to be a method that we can follow when we're asking about what we ought to do, or whether a particular action is right or wrong. So there can be this action guiding element in moral theorizing as well. And it could be something that you consult as you start to try to make decisions about how to act or what to do. And so one thing that moral theorizing can help us do is really extract or bring out these kinds of implications that might come up in both theorizing and in practice, right? I would argue that we might be concerned a lot about practice here in this particular class. And then we want to see how these implications are maybe tested against our intuitions that we have. So I don't know, just to know maybe where you're at when I say the word intuitions. Does anyone have a way to describe what an intuition is? Or do you want to share an intuition that you might have about anything? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so you might have the intuition that murder is wrong. Yeah, do you want to add to that? Interesting. So maybe one that's not been fully deliberated on, you're maybe gesturing towards. Someone else want to try to give their explanation of what they take an intuition to be? Giving us some good groundwork to start with. Someone want to share an intuition? Someone have a different intuition about murder being wrong? You laugh, but some people might, right? Okay. So these intuitions, right, we might say that they're pre-theoretical. They're pre-theoretical notions of some sort of, target of what we're interested in or what we're interested in evaluating. So we might have notions about what we morally ought to do or what's permissible, like whether murder is permissible or not, or what might be obligatory. What would we owe in certain cases, right? I work on climate displacement. What do we owe to climate displaced people? We might have certain pre-theoretical ideas about what that is, right? Those might be our intuitions. But we sort of want to square with our the implications that arise out of our moral reasoning with these intuitions. So we can test maybe whether the particular moral theory we're drawing on might be more or less viable than another one. And while this doesn't tell you necessarily how to decide how you should act right away, we do have, as moral philosophers, this kind of structure for how we should be understanding and adjudicating certain ideas, possibly certain kinds of disagreements. So really briefly, I do want to mention, but I don't super care that you remember this kind of terminology, but often you might hear about deontic or deontology, that word. And deontic moral categories often give us these theories of right conduct. So deontic usually refers to duty. And so these kinds of theories might give us categories for right action. So what types of actions would fall into that bucket, right, of rightness. And then there's certain kinds of moral categories that might provide us with certain kinds of ways to assess value. So I'm going to briefly talk about two kinds of value. It's not up on the slide, but you can write these down because they might be coming up in the context of some of your conversations that we might be having. But there is this notion of intrinsic value and this notion of extrinsic or instrumental value. Has anyone heard that distinction before? Show of hands. Yeah, so if something has intrinsic value, what do you take that to mean? Those of you that raise your hand, yeah. Okay, interesting. So you took the notion of intrinsic value and then you started to make a couple claims about it. So I'm going to stop you because you're already getting into the realm of moral argumentation, but that's great. So something that has intrinsic value has something internal to the thing itself that makes it good or valuable, right? It's not valuable in its service maybe to anything else. So maybe by some quick reasoning, what do you think it means for something to have instrumental value versus intrinsic? Yeah. Someone else could, or you could, right? Yeah. Did you want to add to that behind? Yeah. Okay, so it's value in relation to something else. Yeah. Interesting, right? We might be able to cash your example out in different ways, right? So I like that you gave that to us. So the blanket might still be instrumentally valuable to you if it brings you pleasure, right? Because it's relating to it being an instrument of giving you that kind of pleasure or comfort or something like that. So the blanket isn't valuable in and of itself, but rather that it's valuable to you in this particular way, and it might be valuable instrumentally to somebody else or not have value to somebody else, right? So there we get kind of tricky. So with instrumental value, we're looking at the goodness property, right, of the thing that we're talking about is evaluated with its relationship to something that is good. So the goodness you might think about is borrowed, right? But you had mentioned earlier about something having intrinsic value and then having a particular kind of thing that requires of us. So if people have intrinsic value, right, if they're not good merely instrumentally, then we ought to treat them in a particular kind of way, or they ought to be, maybe seen as worthy of respect or autonomous or something like that. Do you think things can have both instrumental and intrinsic value? Yeah, I would imagine so. I'm just curious about what you're thinking. There might be right answers here, but yeah, does someone have an example of something? Yeah. That's a great example. I might be providing you some instrumental value, right? Well, let's hope, right? About being an educator and here trying to facilitate this discussion about these ideas. So maybe what we're, might be worried about is if I was only regarded as merely having instrumental value. But I think that you might argue I have intrinsic value in and of myself as, an equal human being to all of you. But I also might serve as being instrumentally valuable in you being able to pursue an education, or maybe for you to think a little more reflectively about the choices you make when you go off in the world as citizens or something like that. Yeah, so that's, I think, a great example. Any questions so far on that distinction? Okay, I'm kind of doing like a crash course right now, but I want to get some of these ideas out floating. We're seeing that you also have a lot of ideas already about what these things are and are tracking these kinds of things. Okay, so I mentioned, is this not going to work with me? Let's see. Do you know how this works? Thanks. Yeah, I'm trying to go forward.
Nice sound. I think use this.
It was working?
You have to click in and out.
Got it. Okay. All right, we're good. Thank you so much. Okay. Technology might have instrumental value, we might say. I have questions about whether it has intrinsic value. Okay, so I've been talking about sort of the moral theorizing and the kind of questions that morality is engaged with. But then I was talking a little bit about that, philosophers, moral philosophers and political philosophers might exchange in argumentation. And, just to clarify, when we're talking about argumentation, although it sometimes might sound very heated when you hear two philosophers talking, we're not there, screaming at each other. Well, sometimes we're screaming at each other, fist pounding, so we might attest to that. But the idea is that we're engaged in a certain kind of deliberative process. And what we should be doing, if we're doing our jobs correctly, is an exchange of argumentation and reason giving for certain kinds of points that we're making. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by argumentation as a philosopher, because we see that as a technical term. And you might know or hear or understand argumentation in other contexts and other disciplines. So I kind of want to give you a little brief understanding about when I say an argument, what I would mean by that. So to give an argument is not merely to just assert some kind of opinion, right? The idea behind it is that I would have reasons to back up the particular kind of claim that I'm arguing about. So to give an argument would then mean to offer a set of reasons or evidence in support of some conclusion, right? That's just like a basic framework of what we might take an argument to be. And so what is the structure of an argument? What does it look like out in the wild? It will consist of several parts, right? It's going to be a set of statements, and there's a certain relationship between those statements. So what you're most likely not going to see in an argument structure is something other than a statement. So for example, a question, right? Or an exclamation or something like that. And these statements that are parts of arguments, we often as philosophers refer to them as premises. So you might see when we are talking about some of the things that are going on here, we might name particular reasons in the steps of an argument as premises. I just want you to know these words because we might use them interchangeably, so you have them on your radar. And arguments can serve as this means of inquiry, right? They might help us to organize our thoughts and discover about whether certain views are better than others. And arguments are used to explain and defend, like I said, the positions that we take. Good arguments are not simply going to fist pound. They're not going to simply keep repeating the conclusion as the reasons, right? They're going to give you reasons that ought to convince, I would hope, a relatively open-minded person. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about some examples, right, with moral argumentation. So here are like 4 questions. There's like plenty of questions, right, about what we might want an ethical theory and ethical argumentation to answer for us. So what acts are right and wrong, right, which we've talked about. Which acts ought we perform, where we understand the ought in that question as what? Is it just like a recommendation if it's taking place in a moral argument? If you hear someone like, we ought not murder our neighbor, or you ought not eat animals in this context, that might be a conclusion of a moral argument, but how do we understand that ought? Does it seem, like I said, like a recommendation or, yeah? Yeah, good. So it's highlighting some sort of demand that's on us, right? Something that we're obliged to do based on the reasons that end up supporting that conclusion about what it is that we ought to do. And then questions about, what makes the particular action right and wrong? What is it about the action that determines its moral status? You guys were already tracking that. How do we know what is right or wrong? That can get into some sort of crossover with epistemology, but it's something that ethicists might be talking about. And then there is this question of moral motivation. I'm not going to get into it too much, but moral philosophers might be interested in what, if anything, motivates us to do what is right. And we'll offer different kinds of arguments, right, that might help to answer some of those questions. And those are more general questions, but then there are, of course, the more specific questions, like, whether or not we can, whether we ought, eat animals or not. Okay. So just to kind of summarize this bit about arguments, and I offered some technical language, we see that this moral argument is an argument where the conclusion of it would be some sort of moral statement, right? And the moral statement is a statement asserting that maybe a particular action is right or wrong, moral or immoral, or that a person or a motive is good or bad. So that conclusion, that's going to be the content of it. And it's going to be backed up by reasons or certain kind of premises that relate to one another. And in a moral argument, we may not be able to establish, or we won't be able to establish any conclusion, right, without these premises, without these reasons. So if you are out there reading, right, any of the philosophy that we might be assigning you, or even elsewhere, this is a good exercise in you being able to start to read a little more critically or read like a philosopher. Try to look and see, okay, this particular author, this particular person you're in conversation with is making some claim, is making some sort of statement, or is asserting it. What reasons are they giving for the justification or that support that kind of statement? So when you're reading and you see someone make a moral claim, if they're doing their job, somewhere in there, there's going to be some reasons, right? So, some moral reasons. A lot of times, one of the premises or one of the reasons that will be floating around is actually a moral principle itself. Will be a rule drawn from a particular moral theory that lends itself justification, lends itself as a source of justification for the conclusion. You want me to say that again? Or give an example? So oftentimes, there might be a particular kind of conclusion, right, about it's morally wrong to eat animals. there's going to be reasons that support that conclusion in a moral argument. And one of those reasons, one of those premises, oftentimes will be a stated moral principle that derives out of a particular moral theory. So for example, actually those of you that have been in philosophy classes before, are you familiar with any moral theories in particular? You might have come across them if you took an ethics class. Okay, if you don't remember the name, but yeah. Okay, cool. Do you remember what consequentialism was? Is the right thing to do. Good. So a moral theory like consequentialism evaluates the rightness or wrongness of a particular, let's say, action with its consequences, right? The kind of thing that it might bring about. So in this case, right, the claim that you're talking about is bringing about the most good. So if someone says you should not eat animals, one of the reasons in the argument that would relate then to some other reasons to get to that conclusion might be a commitment to one stated, a consequentialist moral principle, that one of the reasons to not eat animals is because doing so would not bring about the most good. Right? And we'll see how that works in action when we start looking at some of the arguments, especially in the context of climate change and some of the environmental ethics stuff that we're going to get into. So just so you can kind of see the structure of an argument, it's going to be this chain of reasoning, and it'll move from a premise to a premise, or oftentimes a premise and an assumption that's being built in. And I bring up assumptions because oftentimes they might sneak in there. And sometimes philosophers may not even realize that they're building an assumption in. And so we want to detect what's operating or what's doing work in the argument. Sometimes certain assumptions will be explicitly stated. Someone will just say, I'm assuming X and going to still argue from there. So a famous example with Judy Jarvis Thompson's arguments about abortion is she states the assumption that she's going to recognize the fetus as a person, even though that's a contested thing. And then she wants to see if, even if I assume the fetus is a person, can we get to the conclusion that abortion is morally right or morally justified? Right? So there she's very explicit about the assumption because she wants to argue with anti-abortion arguments on their own terms. And a lot of anti-abortion arguments, for example, proceed by some certain, controversial claims about whether the fetus is a person. Okay? Does that make sense? So you might want to, when you're reading, also try to detect what kinds of assumptions are stated or maybe implicit in the arguments that we're getting through. Okay. So I started talking about arguments, and these are the sort of currency within which we communicate and exchange with one another. And the hope is that the reason why we're doing so is that we're hopefully expecting that there's certain kinds of moral evaluation that can go on. Or we want to create the possibility for moral criticism or some sort of constructive dialogue, hopefully with the point towards improving, right, the moral status of whatever we're evaluating or about our own actions and things like that. So we engage in this kind of moral argumentation hopefully with that in mind. I mean, it can also just be a pure exercise if you want, and you can get really good at irritating your family over Thanksgiving. But the hope is if we're in good faith argumentation, especially about moral and political issues, what we're trying to get at, right, is looking to see whether we need to revise certain kinds of claims or arguments that we're making, or whether certain circumstances that might have seemed, morally justifiable might not be. Right? And so we're there doing this kind of constructive dialogue with one another when we're engaging, or at least the goal, right, when we're engaging in moral argumentation. So what I hope you are not is Calvin, right, in the cartoon. We are here, right, in this open space of deliberation, but still recognizing that there's a force of arguments that we're evaluating its strengths of. And so there might be reasons to, assume, or might be reasons to defend one over another. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this. in terms of where controversial ethical or moral or political exchanges might happen, and a particular kind of method that might be able to also adjudicate certain kinds of inconsistencies that might come up when we are reflecting in this way. So this was in the reading, and Marion Hortequin's reading, and she's drawing from a concept that was sort of made clear by John Rawls. So there's a picture of him, extremely famous political philosopher. And it's this notion of reflective equilibrium. And I want to use this term because I think and I want to introduce it because I think it is a strategy that we might, in a framework within which we might see what we're doing together, maybe even, right in this class and with one another. So this method of reflective equilibrium, we need this, particular strategy, presumably because even though we have different ethical commitments, or we might have different sets of ideas and beliefs, right, and values, we still want to live in a well-coordinated society, right? So we might have disagreements about what we ought to do facing challenges of immigration, but presumably we're still committed mutually, at least maybe we ought to be, to live in a well-coordinated society. So we have to come to certain kinds of decisions on a range of controversial things. And in this class, we're literally trying to look at a range of controversial and serious problems and challenges that we're facing. So for example, the question of how should pollution be regulated, we're going to have to come to some sort of, discussion and deliberation about these questions. And in order to coordinate our actions towards addressing these sorts of things, reflective equilibrium might help. So setting aside right now whether or not there is some objective truth that we're all aiming to get to, we can still evaluate whether some ethical views might be more viable than others, especially in the context of whatever it is we're deliberating about. And so Rawls proposes this and describes this method of reflective equilibrium. And so we use this notion of reflective equilibrium, right, or this structure, this framework, to bring certain ethical principles or worldviews or even our intuitions about specific things in alignment with one another. And I'll give an illustration of what this might look like. So for example, if your principles conflict with certain ethical beliefs about certain cases, you might just then have an inconsistency you have to address, right? You'll have to make some sorts of adjustments to get those things in some sort of equilibrium. So that might mean that you'll have to maybe revise some of those principles or some of those committed ethical beliefs to bring them into balance. And when we're doing this process of reflective equilibrium, this is the point, right, of values that will connect to the later part of the lecture, we might help expose values that will be at play that underline our reasons and our actions. So we want to kind of just start where we're at and reflect in such a way. So I will give you an example. Okay, so, and this is the example that was in the reading, so if you read it, this would be familiar to you. Okay, so we might have this view that pain is bad, right? So a world with less pain would be a better world. Anyone have that, at least as an intuition, or just curious? Okay. Some of you are like, pain, I'm not so sure about how I feel about it. Okay. Again, different people have different views about this, but let's say we have this idea. But what if I consume items, or what if I consume in such a way that causes animal suffering? So it could be my eating preferences, it could be certain kinds of items that are made from animals or something like that, but it's causing animal suffering. And I don't need that stuff to flourish. I really don't even need those things to survive, right? So I have this idea that a world with less suffering is a better one. But I, in practice, have these kinds of commitments that, it's okay to consume in this way, even though it causes animal suffering. So using this method of reflective equilibrium, we can examine these potentially conflicting commitments. So what might be in conflict, right, with this scenario? Does someone want to kind of like explain to me what the issue might be? Maybe you are this person, and you genuinely believe that a world with less suffering is better, but you also might be engaged in practices that cause animal suffering. It's not necessarily inconsistent. There might be cases where it's not, but where might there be a conflict here? This is me just asking you to kind of re-say back to me what I just said, but in your own words. Does someone want to give it a stab? Yeah. Yeah, like your action, thank you. So your actions are not really in line, right? Or the ways that you're consuming are not really in line with your committed, moral principle that you're supposedly holding up. Now, one might think that animal pain or suffering is less than, let's say, human suffering. So they might try to make these views coherent by offering a more refined idea about what they, a more specific idea about what they might mean by suffering. Or, like you just pointed out, you might actually find out that your behavior is not actually in line with moral commitments, right, that you're otherwise subscribing to. So reflective equilibrium helps to push us towards some sort of coherence amongst our beliefs and practices. But also, and I'm kind of going to put out there that it might bring to light these incoherences in the moral commitments or contradictions. And in and of itself, that might be helpful because it helps to start putting pressure on where we might need to change. Right? You might have some certain ideas about that climate change is bad and that we ought to be doing everything we possibly can. And we might have disagreements about what we need to do. But then you have this chance, right, using reflective equilibrium with one another, together in this class, and also with your own ideas, about to what extent the other things that you might be committed to or involved with might actually rub up against that in a way with some tension. So here we kind of see that certain kinds of values that underlie our reasoning and our action can become exposed. Okay? Okay, so this is a clicker question. Let's see if I know how to do that. is this a touch screen or no, it's an arrow. So I'm going to turn the little cloud on. No? I just go poll, play. Did that work? Okay. Is it working? Do y'all see it? No? Okay. We're going to kind of do what happened last time from the computer, but these are questions I'm just curious about where you're all at. So, do you think right or wrong, the notions, right, are relative to what an individual person's moral beliefs are? Do you think right or wrong is relative to the certain traditions or practices or culture of a society or group? Or do you think that right or wrong are not dependent on maybe a particular individual's view or a particular society? So presumably it's working now. And I would like to see where you all fall in light of these questions. So I'll give you a second. We still got some coming in, so. All right, I will, oh, we got 100. Oh, 101. This is so exciting. I don't know how many of us there are in here, so. All right, I'll, for the sake of time, show the results. I think you can still respond while I show the results. Okay, so it looks like about a quarter of you think that right or wrong is relative to an individual's moral beliefs. Oh, you can't? How would I display the results? I know.
I think you just have to tell them the results. Just tell them the results.
Okay. I'm going to tell you the results. I promise I'm not lying. I'm an ethical philosopher, right? Doesn't mean I'm not lying. But I'm not lying in this case. I can show you the screen if you want to come around. So 23% of you clicked A, 45% of you clicked B, and 33% of you clicked C. So it looks like there's slightly more of you for B, that you think right or wrong is relative to the practices of a culture, society, or group. Some of you think it's relative to individuals, and some of you think neither of that's the case. So I just want, you don't have to answer what you actually specifically answered here, but I'm curious, for those of you, let's say, that clicked B, what are some of the reasons why you think this might be the case, or where you're coming from? Yeah? Okay, interesting. So you're making the claim that there is a diversity of cultures in the world, right? And then interesting. So there's a certain kind of argument maybe that you're making for tolerance, right, of these differences that might be something that we ought to aim for. Is that kind of what you're doing? Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind, but it looks like some people, so I'll speak to that in a second, but what do some other of you think? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Does someone else want to add to that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Did anyone pick C? Yeah, you want to share why? Okay, good. So I'm glad that you brought up the example of slavery. So one might argue that culturally, enslaving people was culturally acceptable, right, according to the justifications at a particular time. But the argument you're making is, regardless of the cultural commitments of the time, slavery was always and will always be wrong. Yeah, want to add to that? And then, yeah. Okay, so and maybe there's like a dominant cultural commitment that subsumes other things, and there's doing wrong or harm in that context. Yeah, and then I'll come back. Yeah. Hmm. Mm-hmm. 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 Thanks. Yeah, so I do want to clarify one point, and just for the sake of time, I do want to comment on what a lot of you have said, which is super helpful and super interesting for this conversation. The question is not necessarily asking the sort of like sociological question of where these beliefs come, but whether you think morality itself, right, and maybe moral truths. Well, in the case of A and B, you wouldn't think there are any particular moral truths because you think they would be relative to a particular culture or to a particular individual. But the question is about where we can see, or where these moral principles kind of arrive out of, right? Or you're making the description that they may arrive out of the case. So it might be true that people get their ideas from their society, right? That you might get your ideas from your parents or all that sort of thing. But the question here is looking a little bit more closely about whether you even think, in the case, let's say, of A and B, you would even be able to have moral disagreement. Right, so if you think that morality is relative to a particular culture, that means that at that point, you wouldn't really be able to make, possibly you wouldn't be able to make claims on one culture or the other because you just think that those moral truths are relative, or those moral commitments are relative to that community, right, or that particular cultural state. It's a little different. So this kind of distinction you're making between, like, in theory, I think morality comes apart from cultures and individuals, but in practice, it might be problematic to impose certain kinds of things on people. I think what you're all tracking is a really important consideration that we would not be doing good faith moral deliberation, right, if we were saying, you need to take on a particular kind of view, and there's no reasons for it, and we're imposing this on you. But that's very different than deliberating about whether or not something's right or wrong. And there might be certain cases where we might argue, right, in the example, right, of slavery, that you ought not enslave people, regardless of what your cultural commitments are. But we would have reasons for why that might be the case. Right, that we ought not violate the autonomy of individuals, right? Especially when all people are equal, things like that. So I do like that all of you are really worried about the imposition, especially the imposition of particular kinds of cultural assumptions and norms on other people. I think that's a very good intuition to have, and something that's going to be coming up, because a lot of the things we're going to be interrogating in class are like, from whose perspective might some of these arguments be coming from. But a case that I want to make here really briefly, I know we're going a little bit over, and I'll expand a little bit on this, is that there are some problematic consequences, right, to maintain the sort of cultural relativist position that there's this idea that we should understand what's morally right and wrong in a way that's analogous to whatever a society might think is right or wrong. And so I'll leave you with these, and I'll also put these on some notes that I'll share on the Canvas because we're not able to get through all of them today. But with some consequences of moral relativism, it might follow that the fact of some sort of deep-seated moral disagreement may not actually be able to be true. And we want to think about what that would mean or what that would entail. Would you even be able to have cross-cultural criticism or even intracultural conflict? And the thing that maybe is the thing I'm most concerned about, if we were committed to a view of cultural relativism, would we even be able to start to advance to try to make moral progress? Would we be able to even negotiate in the space of deliberating about whether or not certain kinds of actions that we're doing are problematic or ought to be revised? So is there something about a commitment to cultural relativism that might impede certain kind of moral progress? And can we have moral progress and deliberation in the kinds of ways that we're talking about without, right, imposing certain kinds of dominance on other people and things like that? So I want to make sure that we clarify all of these things, and I think that your commitments about tolerance are really important. A lot of cultural relativists often cite tolerance, but there is also the question of whether tolerance is an overarching value. So we tolerate things like slavery? That's actually an open question. Right? So it may also be the case that certain kinds of commitments to tolerance could be overridden. So I'm just throwing some of these ideas out there. I have a little document that starts posing some of these questions for all of you to consider in light of what you answer on the clicker question. We didn't get to the deep dive into what I think some of the moral problems arising out of climate change are, but that's literally for the rest of my lectures. So you're all good, but the lecture will be up there. Thank you for giving me 5 extra minutes. Yeah, have a great weekend.